The Holy Gospel according to St. Matthew, the 21st chapter. Glory to you, O Lord. Jesus said to the people, "Listen to another parable. There was a landowner who planted a vineyard, put a fence around it, dug a winepress in it, and built a watchtower. Then he leased it to tenants and went to another country. When the harvest time had come, he sent his slaves to the tenants to collect his produce. But the tenants seized his slaves and beat one, killed another, and stoned another. Again, he sent other slaves more than the first, and they treated them in the same way. Finally, he sent his son to them, saying, 'They will respect my son.' But when the tenants saw the son, they said to themselves, 'This is the heir. Come, let us kill him and get his inheritance.' So they seized him, threw him out of the vineyard, and killed him. Now when the owner of the vineyard comes, what will he do to those tenants?" They said to him, "He will put those wretches to a miserable death and lease the vineyard to other tenants, who will give him the produce at the harvest time." Jesus said to them, "Have you never read in the Scriptures, 'The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone'? This was the Lord's doing, and it is amazing in our eyes. Therefore I tell you, the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to a people that produces the fruits of the kingdom. The one who falls on this stone will be broken in pieces, and it will crush anyone on whom it falls." When the chief priests and the Pharisees heard this parable, and they realized he was speaking about them, they wanted to arrest him, but they feared the crowds because they regarded him as a prophet. The Gospel of the Lord. So, every time I read the parable in today's Gospel reading, in the back of my mind, I just can't help but wondering, what were these people thinking? I mean, their actions were outrageous and extreme. But beyond that, they made no sense. How could they possibly have thought that they could gain anything for themselves by beating up and killing the slaves and the son of the landowner? I mean, that's not the way to get what they want. What were they thinking? But maybe part of the point of the parable is that they weren't thinking. These people didn't have a well thought out plan. They didn't seem to have any direction in their lives, and indeed, they had lost sight and focus of what they were supposed to be about. They weren't thinking. They were just reacting. And they reacted from a sense of isolation and burden and routine, instead of from a sense of connection and opportunity and purpose. Jesus sets up this parable using some images which would have been familiar to his first hearers. He describes a vineyard in exactly the same way as Isaiah does in our first reading today. And the vineyard was often in the Old Testament a symbol for Israel. And into this vineyard, the owner of the vineyard, God, calls tenants, the symbol for people who are supposed to be good stewards, taking care of the vineyard and making it function properly. But as the months and the years go on, the people in the vineyard, these tenants, these stewards, they lose focus and they lose vision because they get caught up in a sense of isolation. They seem to get the idea that they are all here by themselves, that they don't see the landowner, and so they start to feel as though the landowner is not still involved and not still connected to the project. In fact, this sense of isolation grows so much that they even seem to get caught up in a sense of being freaked out when the representatives of the landowner show up and say, "Hey, remember the landowner? Oh my gosh, who are you? You're somehow, an enemy of us." They don't even look to the landowner to provide help. That the landowner would clearly have been responsible for giving, and he was clearly willing to give. These tenants, they get caught up in a sense of burden. Because when you feel like you're all alone and everything depends on you, you often start feeling this overwhelming sense that you have to take care of everything. And when that happens, you usually get blind to the opportunities, the promise, and the potential that may be right in front of you. You don't have the ability to envision something bigger because you're just trying to take care of the daily burden. And that's what happens with these tenants. They aren't day laborers. They have a permanent job and a significant stake in what happens in the vineyard. When they are tenants, they share in the crop just as the landowner does. So when things go well, they get more. They have the ability to have a great share in what's happening here. They have tremendous potential, but they just can't see it anymore. And these tenants, they get caught up in a sense of routine. Because often, when you're feeling alone and burdened with the load of the world upon you, you sometimes get through it simply by putting one foot in front of another, and you forget what the routine is all about. It seems like these tenants in the vineyard were so into the routine that they really had lost sense of the point of being involved in this at all. They had forgotten that the whole operation was about bearing fruit. You know, this parable, it appears in all three of the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which does not always happen. And sometimes the parable is told with a slightly different twist. Matthew here specifically says it was told as a criticism of the religious leadership of the time. But I think Jesus intended it to have meaning beyond that. In fact, anytime we read a parable, and it's easy to think, oh yeah, this is Jesus smacking down how bad they are and how they didn't do what they were supposed to do, we have missed the point. This parable is told and remembered because Jesus wants us all to get something out of it. And this parable, I think, is especially important for us in our world today because this is a time that we're living in when it's easy to fall into the same trap as these vineyard tenants. We live in a society that's more and more caught up in a sense of isolation and burden and routine. And it can be easy to get sucked into the chaos and the dysfunction that so often surrounds us. Indeed, the sense of isolation and burden so many people feel personally is one of the most serious problems mental health professionals tell us that we face today. Yet Jesus tells this parable because there is another way. And the way that Jesus showed his disciples to live was exactly opposite of the way these tenants in the vineyard are living. And actually, I think one of the reasons that this parable is remembered is because it sets up a contrast for the way that Jesus taught people to live. And the way Jesus taught people to live was with a sense of connection and opportunity and purpose, rather than a sense of isolation and burden and routine. And while it's not often easy, it's important for us as individuals and a community to struggle against that isolation and burden and routine by actively focusing on connection instead of isolation. You know, it's one of the good things about our upcoming Fall Festival. It helps us to build connection with others in the community around us. So much of the deterioration of our social life has come from isolation, often made worse by COVID in the last couple of years. And rebuilding connection with others in the world around us is actually what Jesus did and what Jesus calls us to do, even when others don't share our faith or beliefs. And it's what makes people neighbors and friends instead of adversaries. So if all that happens in our fall festival is that we get to know some neighbors that we didn't get to know before, and we get to build some connections with other people in our community, that's worth doing. And that's what Jesus calls us to do each and every day anyway. Because that's what Jesus did as he roamed around various places. He didn't lay heavy guilt trips on people. He rebuilt connections with people who thought that they were disconnected and isolated from one another and disconnected and isolated from God. For us too, Jesus calls us to focus on opportunity instead of burden. You know, it is easy to become weighed down with burden. Every time I start to read the news, the weight of the world comes more upon me, and I'm like, I don't want to listen to the burden anymore. Example, over the past few years, we have all become much more aware of racial injustice and the burden that it has been to individuals, groups, and society at large. But honestly, sometimes when I read my emails from national church leaders who say, these are the ways you should deal with this, it sounds to me, or it feels to me, like you should wallow in the burden a whole lot more. And that just doesn't seem to me to be terribly helpful. But a few months ago, Prince of Peace got an opportunity to host the Juneteenth celebration. And this came about I was involved in this, and I'm not exactly sure, in the decision-making in this, I'm still not exactly sure how this opportunity actually came about, but the site next door here is a historic church that always had a Juneteenth celebration, but they are remodeling it, and it's under construction. And so because we had connections with people who are part of that group, they said, oh, would it be okay if we held our celebration at your church, because you're next door, and you guys could come too, and that would be great. And we said, sure, that would be all right. We'd be up for doing that. And then somehow it morphed into this, hey, let's invite everybody in the community. And it ended up being a multi-religious, huge event that we had 170 people here with all kinds of stuff and party on the patio. In the process of doing that, a whole bunch of us learned a lot about racial injustice, the history of slavery, the continuing problems that happen in our world. And we built connections with people who experience those kinds of problems more intensely than many of us do. It was a thing that came about because we had an unexpected opportunity, and instead of just wallowing in the burden, we actually took advantage of an opportunity to do something positive and productive. And we built connections with people in our community that we continue to live into those relationships in our common life together when we did our Interfaith 5K and things like that. But that's the kind of thing that can happen when you are open to unexpected opportunities God puts before you, instead of just focusing on the burdens. It's the problem the tenants had in the parable. They didn't look for the new opportunities, they just focused on the burden. And Jesus calls us always to look for the opportunities we have, even when they're things that we didn't envision and plan for. And for us too, Jesus calls us to be people who focus on purpose instead of just on routine. I get caught up in routines an awful lot. I don't know about you, and routines actually really do have value. But the value of routine is in serving a purpose. And sometimes remembering and reflecting on the purpose keeps me from getting sucked into just the routine. Because as I go through the day and through the week, I realize there's a whole lot of routine stuff I just got to do. But when I step back and say, yeah, okay, part of the routine is we got to get bulletins done and stuff like that, the purpose of that is to ensure worship happens and people can fully participate in worship. Yeah, we got to make sure that the building gets fixed and maintained and cleaned and all that kind of stuff, but the purpose is that we have a space where people can gather and grow in faith. And yes, we got to have enough money to run things and pay people. But the purpose of what we're funding is to continue to help people experience Jesus and grow in faith. And remembering the purpose and not just the routine helps you stay focused on bearing fruit in the vineyard that God calls us into. So much of the ugliness, chaos, and dysfunction in our world today is caused by or made worse by people getting caught up in a sense of isolation and burden and routine. It happened in the vineyard in the parable, but it's also happening now in the world around us. And it can be easy for us to get caught up in it too. But Jesus shows us that there is another way. It's a way of living in the vineyard of life in the way God intended. And Jesus calls us into that way each day. Jesus calls us to live faithfully in the vineyard by actively seeking and building connection with God and with others instead of being content to live in isolation. Jesus calls us to live faithfully in the vineyard by looking for and taking advantage of new and different opportunities that God gives us instead of simply dwelling on the burdens of life. And most of all, Jesus calls us to live faithfully each day by remembering the purpose God gives us of bearing good fruit with our lives, the kind of fruit which gives praise to God and actual help to others, instead of simply letting ourselves get caught up in the routine.